A Hungarian horntail dives, the camera skimming the arena floor as scorched wings fill the frame, breath and crowd noise cut to total silence. Night at the World Cup campsite, a neon green dark mark erupts in the sky while every heartbeat lands like a drum, smash zoom to Harry's lightning scar. In a desolate graveyard, Voldemort's pallid fingers close around a newborn wand, Avada Kedavra flashes, frozen in Cedric's widening eyes. Hogwarts reignites the long-dormant Triwizard tournament, pitting teen champions against dragons, mere people, and a living maze. Yet the Goblet spits out a fourth name, 14-year-old Harry Potter, yanking what should be schoolyard spectacle into the orbit of real war. The Quidditch World Cup roar, the mayor's song beneath the lake, the awkward Yule Ball crushes, all of it is merely a runway to one graveyard showdown. Goblet of Fire isn't bigger fireworks, same fairy tale. It's the saga's quiet coup. Beneath the blockbuster skin lie three scalpels: tabloid hysteria, institutional denial, and the growing pains of identity rupture. Director Mike Newell trades storybook hues for grounded textures, turning the wizarding world into a political allegory. When facts are mocked and rules are gamed, is courage still worth dying for? The film excised a 20-minute subplot detailing the Crouch family's dealings and Hermione's house elf liberation crusade. Officially, pacing. Unofficially, crew whispers claim the cut exposed how the Ministry underfunded tournament security, reshaping Dumbledore's relationship with the government. The footage's whereabouts remain unknown. An editor once teased, some flames tame dragons, others burn the real. In this video, we'll hunt that missing fire and show how it could tilt the series' entire moral compass. This was the first Harry Potter film to bleed. Not in the literal sense, though there's that too, but in how it exposed the veins of the story. And that shift started behind the camera. Mike Newell wasn't the studio's first choice. After the atmospheric elegance of Alfonso Cuarón in Prisoner of Azkaban, the producers were looking for someone who could handle scale, big sets, big effects, big emotions. But Newell, a veteran of British realism, for weddings and a funeral Donnie Brasco, brought something else to the table: friction. Where Cuarón had woven dreamlike textures into Hogwarts, Newell cracked the walls. He made the corridors narrower, the arguments louder, the relationships more awkward and real. The teenagers looked tired. Puberty hit. Authority figures stopped making sense. This was no longer a world of clean lines and moral clarity. It was starting to feel like life. That discomfort was intentional. In interviews, Newell said he wanted to push the series into emotional violence, a phrase not many directors would dare use in a franchise like this. He fought to make the tasks more brutal. He encouraged the cast to improvise, to stumble, to break rhythm. Behind the scenes, the shoot itself was famously chaotic. Daniel Radcliffe has said that the dragon chase nearly broke him. That wasn't acting. That was survival. And then there's the firestorm that nearly hit the cutting room floor. In early drafts of the script, there was a full arc for Barty Crouch Sr., detailing his collapse under ministry pressure, his son's imprisonment, and the government's role in covering up the scandal. There were monologues that painted the ministry not as negligent, but complicit. There was even a deleted scene with Dumbledore and McGonagall arguing over whether Hogwarts should be hosting the tournament at all, given the lack of security. It all vanished. The studio line? Pacing. Runtime. Focus. But insiders say otherwise. That this footage was deemed too damning. That it made the wizarding government look not just dysfunctional, but morally bankrupt. That it painted Dumbledore not as a sage leader, but as someone willing to roll the dice on a child's life for the greater good. One producer allegedly warned, this turns him from Gandalf into Machiavelli. Whatever the truth, that decision reshaped the film. What we're left with is a version where shadows creep in at the edges, but never fully speak. It's up to us to read what's missing. And Newell's direction makes that absence speak volumes. Take the color grading. Hogwarts shifts from warm candlelight to overcast blues and metallic grays. The halls feel colder. Even the Yule Ball, with all its twinkling charm, carries an undertone of dread. It's a fairy tale set in a country where the trains are late, the press is hostile, and the ministry's smile hides something rotten. Newell would not return for another Potter film. Some say he took the story too dark. Others say he did exactly what the series needed. He broke the spell. And in doing so, made the magic matter more. You can feel the film changing in how the camera moves. There's less flying, less spectacle, and more silence before the fall. In the opening sequence at the Riddle House, the camera doesn't soar, it creeps. It drifts like a ghost down the hallway, lingers on a half-lit fireplace, pauses behind corners as if afraid of what it might find. There are no grand reveals, just the hiss of Nagini and the whispered name, Wormtail. This isn't exposition. It's surveillance. The audience isn't being welcomed into a magical world, we're being warned. That unease grows as the film pushes us into the Triwizard tournament. Notice how each task is shot differently, almost as if each one belongs to a different genre. The first task, the dragon, plays like a blockbuster set piece, full of handheld chaos and wide-angle swoops. But it doesn't feel victorious. Harry doesn't look heroic when it ends. He's not triumphant, he's exhausted. Shaken. The scale is grand, but the emotion is intimate. The camera rests on his face longer than necessary. What should be a cheer is met with silence. Then comes the second task, the lake. The tone shifts. Cinematographer Roger Pratt dims the world into greens and grays. The water's surface isn't reflective, it's murky. We don't dive in, we descend. Sound design disappears almost entirely. The score grows minimal. Time stretches. Harry's body drifts like a body. It's one of the quietest scenes in the series, and one of the most unsettling. And the third task, a horror film. The maze is stripped of detail. There are no creatures at first. No roars. Just whispers. The hedges move like sentient walls. The camera loses focus on purpose. Sound drops to a heartbeat. It's not just danger, it's madness. The maze is less a trial than a psychological test. Who will you be when no one's watching? And that brings us to the most unsettling shot in the film. Cedric's death. It's fast. Brutal. There's no build-up, no slow motion. He drops like a puppet cut from its strings. The camera doesn't even center him. It happens off-angle. Messy. Inhuman. The Avada Kedavra doesn't flash, it stops. And in that stillness, Voldemort returns. But here's the twist. Voldemort isn't the most terrifying character in the movie. That title belongs to Barty Crouch Jr., played with twitching menace by David Tennant. Watch his eyes in the courtroom pensive scene. He's silent, barely restrained, but radiating glee. A predator who loves pretending to be prey. Later, impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, he becomes the audience's surrogate, guiding us, teaching us, even saving Harry's life. We like him. We trust him. That's the trap. This inversion is critical. Because Goblet of Fire isn't about Voldemort's rise, it's about how evil gets welcomed in. And that's where the cultural symbols click into place. Look at the Yule Ball. It's lit like a wedding, soft whites, warm ambers, crystalline backdrops. But there's no joy. The students are awkward. The music clashes. Ron sulks. Hermione cries. It's performative adulthood, kids pretending to be grown-ups in clothes they don't quite fit. Or consider the Dark Mark. It's not just a threat. It's a brand. A sigil designed for maximum psychological impact. It hovers over the World Cup like a drone strike, silent, sudden, and unforgettable. And the Ministry's reaction? Not fury, but PR management. Spin. There's no clearer symbol of this than Rita Skeeter. Her green quill is technically magic, but it's the most dangerous object in the film. She distorts reality, feeds public outrage, and makes Harry question his own mind. Her lies hurt more than curses, and she walks away untouched. That's the world Newell builds. A world where spectacle distracts, institutions manipulate, and truth becomes optional. Where even magic can't protect you from being misunderstood, disbelieved, or used. By the end of the film, Harry's 1-0. There's no house cup. No applause. Just silence. And the camera holds on him, one last time, not as a hero, but as a witness. This is the film where the storytelling stops pretending to be neat. Goblet of Fire breaks the narrative symmetry that defined the first 3 movies. The earlier entries followed a familiar rhythm. Summer with the Dursleys, train to Hogwarts, mystery unfolds, climax in the final act, house points awarded. Even Prisoner of Azkaban, with its tonal shift, kept the narrative clock ticking cleanly. But here, everything starts to blur. The pacing feels off at first. The Quidditch World Cup, spectacularly built up, is cut short. No match. Just chaos. Then comes a string of time jumps, months pass in minutes. Clues are dropped and not revisited. Characters appear, disappear, then return transformed. Some critics called it disjointed, even sloppy. But that's the point. This structure mirrors the experience of adolescence under pressure. Days blur. Friendships fracture. You're being tested but don't understand the rules. You trust the system until you realize there isn't one. What seems like mess is actually mimicry. Newell's approach isn't lazy, it's psychological. And compared to the directors before and after him, Mike Newell is a wild card. Chris Columbus, who directed the first two films, treated the storybook world with reverence. His camera moved like a respectful guest, admiring every portrait, corridor, and spell. He gave us comfort. Alfonso Cuarón brought artistry, dynamic framing, floating transitions, and a sense of magical realism that made the third film feel like a dream collapsing into itself. He gave us poetry. Newell gave us conflict. He's the only director in the franchise who focused on chaos over control. He leaned into the discomfort of being young, angry, confused. He didn't want polished. He wanted honest. You can feel it in the scenes where characters talk over each other, where dialogue overlaps and tempers flare. The fights between Ron and Harry aren't cinematic, they're personal. Paused in all the wrong places, with nothing wrapped up cleanly. This rawness polarized critics and scholars alike. Some praised the film's commitment to emotional realism. They argued that adolescence isn't cinematic, it's fragmented, and that Newell captured that better than any other director in the series. Others, however, saw his approach as too raw, too rushed, too unresolved. They pointed to the jarring tonal shifts, how the comedy of the Obol sits uncomfortably next to Cedric's sudden death. They questioned whether the film knew what it wanted to be, a fantasy epic, a teen drama, or a political thriller. One academic analysis from the Journal of Adaptation in Film and Performance even claimed the movie suffers from narrative identity crisis, arguing that its attempts to balance trauma, satire, and spectacle left it unable to fully commit to any. But another scholar, writing in Cinema and Society Quarterly, praised that same instability as a mirror to post-9/11 youth culture where institutions falter and certainty collapses. It's worth noting, this was the first Harry Potter film released after September 11th, the Iraq invasion, and the global rise of terror politics. Suddenly, the idea of a distant threat returning, of governments lying to protect appearances, and of young people forced into adult roles, all felt deeply resonant. Which brings us back to the story's structure. It's broken, fractured, intentionally, because the world these kids are stepping into isn't safe. It doesn't give you time to breathe. It doesn't explain itself. It changes rules mid-game. Goblet of Fire teaches its audience, viscerally, that life doesn't wait for you to grow up. It just drags you forward, ready or not. And if you're lucky, you survive long enough to understand what it cost you. At its core, Goblet of Fire is a story about systems failing people, and how that failure turns teenagers into soldiers. Let's start with the most overlooked line in the entire film. When Harry returns from a graveyard, Cedric's lifeless body in tow, and the crowd erupts in cheers thinking he's won, Dumbledore doesn't smile. He walks forward and says flatly, he's back. It's not a climax. It's a quiet collapse. What this scene reveals isn't just the return of Voldemort, it's the collapse of belief in protection. Every adult Harry trusted either didn't see it coming or chose to ignore it. And this isn't a one-time mistake. It's systemic. The Ministry of Magic refuses to believe the truth, not because they doubt Harry's account, but because acknowledging Voldemort's return would force them to act. It would cost money, stability, power. So instead, they gaslight a 14-year-old. They spin. They silence. They punish truth to preserve comfort. This isn't just magical politics. It's every system that prioritizes order over justice. And the film is painfully deliberate in showing how those systems manifest. Take the character of Barty Crouch Sr., a high-ranking ministry official. Crouch is obsessed with appearances. He sends his own son to Azkaban to save face. He covers up that same son's escape. He then disappears, both figuratively and literally, from the narrative, silenced before he can reveal the full extent of institutional rot. And who takes his place? Mad-Eye Moody, or so we think. But it's actually Barty Crouch Jr., the very product of that rot. Raised by a man who valued image over integrity, tortured by the ministry's prison system, and radicalized in its shadow. The system created the monster, then lost control of it. This is the film's central paradox. The very people warning of danger are the ones who helped build it. But it goes deeper. Look at the architecture of the Triwizard tournament itself. It's framed as tradition, as diplomacy, as a celebration of magical unity. But beneath that, it's reckless child endangerment dressed in pageantry. The tasks are life-threatening. The rules are vague. The champions have no real agency. It's a ceremony built on blood, designed to thrill an audience, while the adults watch from a safe distance. Sound familiar? It's no accident that the final set piece isn't a monster, but a maze. There are no walls, just shifting hedges. No map. No clear path. Competitors don't lose because they're weak. They lose because the rules bend in real time. The maze doesn't test strength. It tests psychological resilience under unpredictable, often unfair conditions. It's a metaphor for growing up in a world you didn't build, playing a game you don't understand, where even the exit might be a trap. And when Harry finally escapes, when he returns from a graveyard carrying Cedric's body, the adults fail him again. They try to smooth it over, to erase what just happened. They tell him to keep quiet for now. But Harry has seen the truth. And worse, he's seen that truth doesn't matter unless people want it to. That's the real enemy in this film. Not Voldemort, but denial. Voldemort may be the embodiment of evil, but he only rises because good people choose not to see him. And that's what makes this story feel so much more than fantasy. Because we've lived this. We know what it's like to watch leaders pretend a crisis isn't happening. To watch a system ask the young to sacrifice while it protects the powerful. We've seen how myths are used to excuse inaction. How easy it is to mock the truth teller when the lie is more convenient. So what's the lesson? That courage isn't slaying a dragon. It's standing in a room full of people who call you crazy and saying, he's back. That justice doesn't live in institutions. It lives in the choices of those willing to see clearly. And that sometimes the scariest thing about growing up isn't the evil you face, but the adults who pretend it isn't there. There's a moment in Goblet of Fire that feels almost throwaway, but holds the moral weight of the entire film. When Dumbledore gathers the school after Cedric's death, he says, Cedric Diggory was murdered by Lord Voldemort. No euphemisms. No soft language. Just truth. And in the silence that follows, you can feel the room split, not just in grief, but in how ready they are to believe it. Because in this world, saying the truth is an act of rebellion. The societal impact of this moment is huge, because it doesn't just alter the wizarding world's future. It exposes its foundation. The audience witnesses not just Voldemort's return, but a mass refusal to acknowledge it. It's the wizarding world's version of collective denial. And it raises an ugly question. When evil reemerges, who bears the cost of pretending it didn't? In this case, it's teenagers. Harry and his peers are asked to carry impossible emotional burdens. They're expected to survive trauma, suppress fear, and smile for the cameras. The adults. They mostly posture, deflect, and hide behind process. Even Dumbledore, arguably the most powerful figure in this universe, can only do so much. His warnings are ignored. His protections fail. His authority weakens. This imbalance of power is reflected in every layer of the narrative. Take the Ministry's response to the Dark Mark at the World Cup. The victims are blamed. The survivors are interrogated. And the perpetrators disappear into the smoke. No arrests. No consequences. Just spin control. It's not just moral failure, it's administrative convenience. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic, represents this perfectly. He isn't evil. He's worse, he's passive. He doubts, hesitates, and ultimately chooses business as usual over action. His refusal to confront reality delays preparedness, endangers lives, and undermines those who are trying to help. He doesn't cast killing curses, but he kills progress. And then there's the ethical rot at the heart of the Triwizard tournament. Let's be clear, the tournament is a rigged game. From the moment Harry's name comes out of the goblet, everyone claims the magic can't be undone. But who decided that? Who wrote those rules? Who enforces them when a 14-year-old's life is suddenly on the line? No one. The adults hide behind tradition, as if centuries-old magic is a good excuse for endangering kids. This echoes real-world structures where outdated policies continue, not because they work, but because no one wants to be responsible for stopping them. Even more disturbing is how the tournament functions as a distraction. It's a spectacle that keeps the public entertained while the real threat, Voldemort, regains power in secret. The wizarding media, led by Rita Skeeter, plays into this perfectly. She chooses scandal over truth, character assassination over accountability. Her quill doesn't just write lies, it reshapes reality. She's not just a journalist. She's an architect of perception. And perception in this world is more dangerous than any curse. It turns Cedric's death into an unfortunate accident. It reframes Harry's trauma as attention-seeking. It makes Voldemort a myth again, right after he's returned. That's what makes this story so devastating. Not just that evil wins, but that good people help it happen because they're too afraid, too comfortable, or too indifferent to stop it. The ethical breakdown doesn't come with a bang. It creeps in through policy, through passivity, through propaganda, through adults who don't lie. They just refuse to tell the truth. And that's where Goblet of Fire becomes something bigger than a fantasy. It becomes a mirror. It asks, who gets to decide what's real? Who gets to rewrite the rules when they no longer serve justice? And when the system fails you, do you stay silent, or do you speak the name no one else will? Because if you can't say Voldemort, how will you ever stop him? What if the darkest magic in Goblet of Fire isn't in the wand work, but in the world it reflects? For many viewers, Voldemort's return is a fantasy event, a villain reborn, a battle cry. But for others, especially those watching in the mid-2000s, the real fear wasn't in the spell itself. It was in the silence that followed, in the government that denied it, in the media that twisted it, in the institutions that collapsed under their own comfort. And that makes Goblet of Fire less a magical fable and more prophecy. Released in 2005, the film dropped into a world already bracing for crisis fatigue. The United States and Britain were embroiled in wars launched on questionable intelligence. Terror alerts colored the daily mood. Citizens were learning to doubt the headlines and each other. Conspiracy and cover-up were no longer plot devices, they were dinner-table realities. Within that context, the Ministry's denial of Voldemort isn't just dramatic tension. It's political allegory. Fudge doesn't just fear Voldemort, he fears what belief in Voldemort will cost. Panic, disruption, accountability. It's easier, as we see today, to dismiss uncomfortable truths than to restructure the system that failed to prevent them. And Harry? He becomes the symbol of whistleblowers everywhere. Not perfectly polished, not always emotionally composed, but telling the truth anyway, and being punished for it. We've seen this cycle repeat across decades. From Edward Snowden to Greta Thunberg to survivors of school shootings, those who speak first are rarely believed. They're mocked, minimized, and when they persist, they're reframed as dangerous. What Goblet of Fire nails, with startling accuracy, is how power doesn't fear evil. It fears disruption. The Triwizard tournament, then, becomes a metaphor for the systems we build to distract. The spectacle, the sports, the rituals that make us feel unified while masking how broken we've become. The more dangerous the outside world becomes, the more comforting the illusion of control. At least we still have the games, people say, even as the monsters grow louder. But the film doesn't stop at diagnosis. It quietly offers a path forward. Dumbledore's speech at the end is more than a eulogy. It's a call to realism. He says, "The time is coming when we must choose between what is right and what is easy." That line is often quoted, but few realize how radical it is. Because what he's saying is, truth is work. Belief is work. Protection isn't passive, it's proactive. And sometimes the only real power is the decision to speak, even when no one listens. In that way, the film becomes a manual for moral action. It tells us that safety is never guaranteed, that systems will fail, that tradition can be dangerous, and that our job, in times of rising darkness, isn't to find comfort, it's to find each other. We see it in how Harry shares his tournament winnings with Fred and George, planting the seed for a future built on creativity, not combat. We see it in how Hermione refuses to let Skeeter rewrite reality. We see it in how Ron, despite his doubts, shows up for Harry when it counts. And we see it in Harry himself, not the chosen one, not the hero, but the traumatized teenager who tells the truth anyway. That's where Goblet of Fire lands its deepest blow. It doesn't ask us to fight monsters. It asks us to recognize when the world is becoming one, and then to light a wand, even if we stand alone. Because the point isn't that Voldemort returns. It's that he's welcomed back by a world that's too afraid to admit he ever left. Some stories end at the credits. Goblet of Fire didn't. Escape the screen. The fourth film in the Harry Potter series marked a tipping point in how the franchise intersected with culture, not just through fandom, but through the questions it forced audiences to ask long after the lights came up. One of its biggest ripple effects came through meme culture. For all its darkness, Goblet of Fire became unintentionally viral, especially for a single-line delivery. In the book, Dumbledore asks Harry calmly, "Did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire?" But in the film, Michael Gambon barrels toward him, shouting the question with manic urgency. That contrast sparked years of parodies, skits, and critiques. Fans jokingly titled it the Dumbledore Rage Edit. YouTube remixes popped up by the dozens. And while many laughed, the underlying conversation was about fidelity to character, the emotional tone of adaptation, and what happens when performance changes canon. But that wasn't the only place the film hit deep. For a generation coming of age during political instability, Goblet of Fire became a framework to interpret real events. Students drew parallels between Harry and whistleblowers. The Daily Prophet's gaslighting mirrored real-world media spin. Fan essays compared Fudge's refusal to act to climate denial. College courses began teaching the series in political science and ethics seminars. Suddenly, a story about a boy wizard was a case study in governance and institutional trust. And it didn't stop there. Some of the most resonant fanfiction to emerge post-Goblet wasn't romantic, it was investigative. Rewrites exploring what if Cedric had lived, or what if the maze exposed ministry corruption, became full narrative experiments. One especially popular story, The Fourth Name, reimagined the tournament as a government PR stunt gone wrong, framed in the style of the Hunger Games. It wasn't just escapism, it was world-building as resistance. Even academia got involved. Scholar Emily Strand published a comparative study on Goblet of Fire and Cold War media culture, identifying patterns of suppression, hero mythos, and information control. Others explored the film's visual language as post-traumatic cinema, where every wand duel carried echoes of state violence. But perhaps the most powerful cultural echo was personal. For many fans, Cedric's death marked their first confrontation with narrative mortality. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't poetic. It was sudden, arbitrary, final, and that shaped how they engage with stories after. It set a benchmark. Characters could die, institutions could lie, and heroes could lose. But the story could still be worth telling. Which brings us to what you should watch next, not just to complement Goblet, but to deepen it. Film recommendations. Children of Men, 2006, directed by Alfonso Cuarón. This dystopian masterpiece explores institutional failure, human resilience, and the moral cost of hope. If you want to see how a world that refuses to change devours its future, this is it. The Hunger Games, 2012. Beyond the YA packaging, this franchise nails systemic manipulation, media control, and the spectacle of suffering. The Triwizard Tournament's darker cousin. The Lives of Others, 2006, a German-language drama about surveillance, trust, and quiet rebellion in a totalitarian state. For those curious about Barty Crouch Jr.'s mindset, or how institutions radicalize. The Trial, 1962, Orson Welles' Kafka adaptation. A surreal dive into bureaucratic absurdity and paranoia, echoing the ministry's slow suffocation of truth. Book recommendations. The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, a non-fiction exploration of how institutions exploit crises to consolidate power. Pair this with Fudge's Ministry, and the puzzle pieces click. The Giver by Lois Lowry, a deceptively simple novel about a world that erases pain for stability. Think of it as the world Cornelius Fudge wants. We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families by Philip Gorovich, a harrowing non-fiction account of the Rwandan genocide and the world's failure to act. Heavy but essential to understand how silence enables atrocity. Speak by Laurie House Anderson, a novel about a girl who's disbelieved after trauma. It captures Harry's isolation post-graveyard better than any wand duel ever could. Because in the end, Goblet of Fire isn't just one story. It's a lens. And once you've looked through it, once you've seen how fragile truth can be, you start to see those patterns everywhere. In fiction, in history, in your own newsfeed. The question is, what will you do when you see the maze? Soon we must all face the choice between what is right and what is easy. That line from Dumbledore lands like a prophecy. But today, let's read it differently. What if the real choice isn't just about right versus easy, but about seeing versus looking away? In Goblet of Fire, every character makes that choice. Some choose safety, others choose denial. But Harry, shaken and scarred, chooses to see, to speak, even when the world tells him not to. And that choice costs him everything. Which brings us to the question no one wants to ask. What if the story had ended there? What if Harry had been silenced? What if the crowd kept cheering? What if Cedric's death was brushed aside like the Ministry wanted? Would Voldemort still return? Would the next war still break out? Or would it all just rot beneath the surface? Because sometimes the true villain isn't the one casting spells. It's the system that lets him come back. Now imagine a different ending. What if Cedric had survived? A Hogwarts golden boy, loved by all, standing next to Harry with the same truth on his tongue. Two witnesses instead of one. Would the ministry have listened? Would the papers have printed the truth? Or would they still find a way to spin it? To fracture them? Divide them? Erase them? Because that's the brilliance and tragedy of Goblet of Fire. It isn't about what happens. It's about who gets believed. And maybe that's what makes this film timeless. Because in every era, there's a moment when truth becomes inconvenient. When people in power smile and say, let's not cause panic. When someone with nothing to gain tells the truth, and everyone else looks away. But you saw it. You watched a boy walk into hell and come back with someone else's body. You know what that means. So here's your choice. Pretend it didn't happen. Or start asking why it did. And before we go, a little Goblet of Fire trivia you probably missed. Remember the Quidditch World Cup? The actual match, Bulgaria versus Ireland, was never shown in the film. Fans long assumed it was a budget issue. But production insiders later revealed they had begun filming it. Full costume, choreography, even early effects passes. Why cut it? One crew member leaked that the scene was too fun, too triumphant, and distracted from the darker pivot they needed to establish. In other words, even joy had to go quiet. And here's a deleted line from the original script, never filmed, never released. Cedric, looking up at the maze before the third task. Funny, isn't it? They built it, so we get lost. But I've never felt more clear. Now it's your turn. In the comments, describe your feeling after watching Goblet of Fire using just one emoji. And tell me, if you could change one moment in the story, which would it be? Would you save Cedric? Rewrite the tournament? Expose the ministry sooner? Or would you leave it all as is? Because maybe, just maybe, some fires are meant to burn.